Sorry for this one being a little bit later, but I wanted to let this sit for a while because I wanted to have this be the best possible video I could make talking about this show, not be super recent so that I wouldn't just be going off about something I had just seen. I wanted to let it sit. This is a part 3 of a Last of Us series for me. You don't have to watch the other videos, but I will spoil my opinions. So if you want to hear more on the games, go check those videos out, especially the Last of Us Part 2 video. I'm really proud of it, and it would mean a lot to me. But we're finally getting to it, the thing that prompted this big series in the first place for me. HBO's original show, The Last of Us, created by Craig Mazin and written by Mazin and Neil Druckmann, the original creator of the game. It also has that actor that I really love, but then was very embarrassed to love when everyone became obsessed with him for a couple of months and got real creepy with it and made him actively uncomfortable. I hope that's not still going on. But the reason I've kind of sat with this longer is mainly because of expectations. If I can say anything for this series despite my best efforts, it's been driven by a lot of expectations with the reputation the works have. That's why I arguably came off way harder on the original game, even though I still really love it, and I really put my heart out there for part 2 because it got, in my opinion, so much undeserved hate. But then we get to this show. First off, a game adaptation, which brings its own worries, and on top of that, it's an adaptation of a story that means so much to me, and to tons of people, which is dangerous. So I wanted to have as few expectations as possible going into this. I muted the words The Last of Us on Twitter while it was coming out so I wouldn't see other people's opinions. But after the whole show was out, I would watch an episode and listen to the official companion podcast HBO produced, where Neil and Craig talked about the production and thought process behind each episode. And I took lots and lots of notes, and I sat with each episode and then moved to the next, because I really cared with this one about giving this show a fair shot. But despite that, of course, I have a ton of nitpicks. In fact, most of my notes after reading them over are nitpicks, with only occasional interesting observations. So to avoid this being completely annoying and boring as I rage about minor location changes of scenes, though seriously, I heard their reasoning on the podcast, but I still don't get why they would change the location. It was perfect inside of the restaurant. Anyway, to avoid all that, I'm going to break down this video into a nice, digestible, and hopefully interesting way. And the first thing we're going to look at is the actual adaptation. So one thing that was clear to me from the get-go that got a big thing off my chest was the fact that these creators, especially Neil and Craig, knew how and what they needed to do to make an adaptation. This was the biggest challenge the show had to face, and it's where most adaptations, especially of video games, fail. Video games are inherently different mediums from TV shows, which is different from movies, and each often captures certain things that they need or might want to make for it to be an effective story in its medium. In a video game, the big thing is actual gameplay, as unlike movies and shows, it's a medium that you have to actually engage with yourself to progress in. So you have to keep in mind, is it fun? Do we need more combat? Is this too hard or too easy? As well as factors for a story game like The Last of Us for storytelling, pacing, when should you do a cutscene? How can I communicate these ideas effectively through the gameplay? To create a really great, effective game takes a lot of work, but a TV show brings completely different needs. You no longer are playing a game, so you can't have as much non-stop combat. You're not inherently engaged by movement, so you need strong enough characters and stakes to keep viewers engaged each week. And with that comes the fact that you can't be as solo-focused as a game. You can't just follow Joel around for hours and hours of television. You need other characters. So how does the show actually perform? Well, honestly, in my opinion, it kind of blows it out of the water. The show effortlessly, and with a lot of thought behind it, follows the beats of the story almost exactly while cutting out everything that might not work and adding so much not only to enhance the world, but the actual themes of the show. We have flashbacks and cold opens almost every episode to make the world building more natural, which is harder with a show than a game, while also allowing it to explore more specific ideas that would make game fans really happy, answering a lot of questions they might have had. And as early as episode 3, it becomes really apparent to the show's priorities. This episode might be my favorite of the show, but episode 3, titled Long Long Time, follows the story in the game pretty close to the beginning, where Joel takes Ellie to Bill, an almost insane-seeming survivalist who ends up helping them get a truck on their way to go west. And while they're there, he shares about Frank, his former partner, who ended up getting fed with Bill's more extreme survival tendencies, and goes off on his own and ends up dying. It's a very tragic bit of world building in the game that sets up the themes of love, but also being one of the first things to truly set a darker tone for the game itself. But in the show, we've already had time with our different perspectives to show a lot more of the harshness of the world. So the creators had the idea to change this from a tragic piece of world building to a brilliant and engaging romance story that sets up the themes of love and hope in a show so lacking of it. Instead of Bill being alive, both of them are already dead by the time Joel and Ellie get there, and for the majority of the episode, one of the longest episodes of the show, we follow a flashback of how Bill and Frank met, fell in love, and how Bill's worldview was changed, and even how they met Joel and Tess, and it's genuinely a beautiful episode. Nick Offerman and Marie Bartlett give such strong and emotional and full-of-life performances, and the actual ending was well thought through and poignant as we get to see people truly getting to have a happy and full life, even in the apocalypse, ending it on their own terms while also continuing a tone of tragedy for Joel when they're both dead by the time he gets there. This is a great episode for new people to the world and the story, as it's a very standalone emotional story that ties itself heavily into the themes already set up in the first 2 episodes, and has just enough Joel and Ellie to make it feel like we're not watching a completely different show. And it's also great for fans of the game, because this right here is about as major as any of the changes to the game's story get, changing the fate of Bill and Frank, and changing it into something that allows players to see a side of the world they never would have seen otherwise. And again, listening to the creators, this didn't just happen. Everything was thought through, even down to the casting of Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey, who both of which pretty much carry the emotional weight in storytelling on the backs of their performances. More on that in the nitpicks, but their casting wasn't just getting a big-name actor at the time and someone who was young and vaguely spunky. They put a lot of thought into it. The casting director, Victoria Thomas, worked alongside Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson, the original actors to portray Joel and Ellie in the game, to find someone who not only fit the descriptions and requirements, but also who they felt a connection with, and who felt a connection to the characters, as Troy and Ashley had poured so much of themselves into the characters with the way they went about shooting and writing the first game. And what came out of it was absolutely brilliant casting and performances that yet again feel very new and fresh and outstanding, with Pedro bringing so much depth to his more silent performance as Joel, and Bella just perfectly capturing the spirit of Ellie in a way that I'm not sure really anyone else could. They have depth and emotion, but still feel so much like a kid that's been forced into all this crap. But these performances also make original fans happy because these characters are so in line with what they're doing in the games, while also giving them even more depth in different ways. See also the nitpicks. And honestly, to me, one of the funniest things that came out of this being such a good adaptation is people finally understanding that oopsie whoopsie, the killing of everyone at the end is supposed to be tragic. You can boil the spirit of this show down to a lot of things, but I think they explored it very well in the podcast, that it's about the good and the bad of love framed through the ultimate trolley problem. And the thing about the trolley problem is that neither answer is inherently morally good. And Joel, as a character, is supposed to honestly make the more questionable but understandable to a parent decision, one that Ellie herself doesn't like. So being able to properly frame the scene with brutal and tragic cinematic language and music, showing the actual terrible actions Joel takes in that light, is a really great change that the game, needing it to have an action scene of gameplay, doesn't really capture. What makes this funny to me is, yet again, the one thing I did see from Twitter was people still getting mad about how quote-unquote negatively this show paints Joel. Yet again, people miss the point of these games by a mile. But on top of that, I would argue that this show is far more sympathetic for Joel than the game is, giving him a lot more personal struggle with himself and adding in anxiety and the fact that he tried to kill himself and the fact that he generally kills and tortures way more people in the game. But people don't think about that in a video game because that's just what you do in shooter games. You kill people. Again, one of the reasons I think The Last of Us Part 2 is such a brilliant game, because it forces players to reconcile with the very act of playing a shooter game. But anyway, you get a way more sympathetic Joel because of the medium they're working in, and people still got mad that his actions were framed in a negative light. It's crazy. But one thing that remains clear to me this entire show is honestly that the adaptation is just good. I could go on for a while picking apart more of the adaptational changes, or even just playing different clips from the podcast showing the amount of thought they put into the fact that this was a TV show. The show creators knew the difference in the mediums, something I was scared about with Neil being on the writing team, and forgive me, Neil, I'll never doubt you again. And they knew what they needed to do to make an engaging and emotional television experience that would be memorable for fans and newcomers alike, that explored new depths while also fleshing out and hitting the beats that worked best for the games. So, yeah, it's almost a best-case scenario for an adaptation like this, and I really can't complain that much, though I do have a few problems that I'll get to. And one actual major one that I don't think quite qualifies as a nitpick that we're going to get into by looking at each individual episode. So my biggest problem with the show itself is really one of pacing. This show was big. I'm talking really big. It was filmed mostly in Canada and was allegedly one of the biggest, if not the biggest, film projects ever done there budget-wise, with the budget exceeding even that of Game of Thrones episodes. And originally, and you may have heard this before, The Last of Us was going to be adapted into a movie, which was announced all the way back in 2014, but it never really went anywhere, and by 2016, nothing was really happening, and by 2019, the plans were canceled altogether, as they made the Uncharted movie instead. But Craig Mazin, who had previously created the acclaimed Chernobyl, was approached by PlayStation with a list of games they wanted to adapt, and he was so disappointed that they were trying to adapt The Last of Us into a movie because to him, it seemed a stupid decision for the story. It needed the time and pacing of a TV show. So anyway, production talks and approvals later, and we have the show version of The Last of Us. But I bring this up to show that Craig Mazin, a guy who, after hearing about him talk about this stuff for a while, seems to have a really good sense of how to write for television, and was given an absolutely insane budget to make it happen, and that pretty much everyone in the industry, when they heard we're making a Last of Us show, wanted to help on. And yet it still shocks me that the season is only 9 episodes long. I understand the idea behind it because I'm sure, again, with how thoughtful these writers are, that they didn't want anything to come across as filler or to deviate too much from the beats they were going for, but what it leads to for me is something I want to look at for the show as a whole. Alright, so I'm going to do this by breaking down a brief synopsis of each episode one by one. So let's look at Episode 1, a very good and well-rounded adaptation of the opening game, with a little extra meat added here and there, that really gets us into Joel as a character and his tragic motivations as we follow him and Tess in an effort to get a car battery to find Joel's brother Tommy, and they get stuck with Ellie. This is a good episode. Episode 2, Ellie starts to explain and try to convince them of her immunity, and they start their journey to the State House, where they are supposed to meet the Fireflies. Ellie is bitten yet again. So they finally believe her. Tess is bitten and has a very cool death compared to the game in my opinion. There are no Fireflies there, and Tess makes Joel promise to take Ellie, so yet again, This is a great start, and now we're ready to get to the meat of the show. But as you can see, we're already 2 episodes in out of 9, and while I wouldn't do anything to make these episodes any faster so far, to only get to the inciting incident within the first 2 episodes was already kind of a red flag for just how short this season is. Episode 3, favorite episode of the show, as I've already said, follows mostly backstory of Bill and Frank as Joel takes Ellie to their house to try and get help. It's beautiful, but we spend a majority of the time of the episode with them and not Joel and Ellie. Now on their own for the first time, but at the end they get a car and go on their way. Episode 4, Joel and Ellie take a detour into Kansas City and get attacked and caught up in this big revolt thing as evil revolutionary leader Kathleen tries to find Joel and Ellie, who she thinks is working for a mysterious man named Henry. Joel and Ellie find safety, and then they get found by Henry and his younger brother Sam. Again, a fine episode, if not a little unfocused, especially on Joel and Ellie. We spend a lot of time showing a lot of stuff that doesn't really go many places. Though there's a lot of good stuff here, especially with Ellie having to shoot someone, but a lot of the episode is mostly just them running around trying to hide. Episode 5, they talk with Henry and Sam and find that maybe they can join forces to help escape the city as Kathleen continues her brutal search for Henry while ignoring a big infected problem brewing. This culminates during Joel, Ellie, Henry, and Sam's escape attempt and the sniper scene from the game and the biggest infected scene in the show, with hundreds of infected bursting out from under the city, saving our 4 characters from essentially certain death, but not without Sam getting bit along the way. So on the surface again, this episode is fine, if not the most boring 2-episode span of the show. I love Henry and Sam's stories in the game a lot, and heck, I like it here too, but to be in episode 5 out of 9 and taking this much time with these characters and showing so much of Kathleen, whose performance is really fun, but the actual character is kind of boring to me, made me completely disconnect with this. It seems unnecessary for it to span this long, even though it wouldn't make sense to be shorter for Henry and Sam. But I think I'm justified in this being my least favorite episode span, as this episode has the lowest viewership of any by far, according to the stats on Wikipedia. Episode 6, only 3 more episodes to go. This one, they finally get to Jackson and meet up with Tommy and see everything going on in Jackson. Most of the plot of the episode is Joel talking with people about things or Ellie talking with people about things until Joel tries to push Ellie off on Tommy because he's having anxiety about keeping her safe, and because of this conflict, they don't talk much until one fight, and they decide they're going to go together and head out for the university that they think the Fireflies will be based at. When they get there, the Fireflies are gone, but seem to have gone to a hospital, and then they get attacked by raiders, and Joel gets stabbed as the raiders get away. Episode 7, unlike the actual game, they slot in the story from Left Behind into the actual show, which is something I criticized the original game for, so I was really happy with this. But we spend most of this episode, just like the DLC, seeing Ellie trying to take care of a dying Joel as we flash back to her with Riley. This plotline is adapted very well, and I love watching this episode and the little details that we get, especially the performances. It's really great. But again, if you'll notice, Joel and Ellie are more or less separated by the narrative for most of it. Episode 8, right before the end of the show, and we have another almost exactly grabbed from the game plot, as Ellie, in search for supplies and for food and medicine for Joel, comes across David, who seems willing to trade with her until, oh no, he's evil, and he's been feeding his followers humans without them knowing. There's some genuinely great stuff in this episode, especially in the interactions between David and Ellie. Joel, after getting some medicine from Ellie, must now save Ellie and avoid getting killed, as the person they killed at the university was one of the people in David's little cult, and they want revenge. The end of this plays more or less the same as the game, as Joel kills all of the people, and Ellie ends up having to brutally kill David just as Joel reaches her. Again, probably one of the best episodes of the season. It's really powerful and well acted, and it's exciting, but Joel and Ellie are separated for most of it, and we only have 1 episode left. Episode 9, this is another very by-the-game episode, even though it's very rushed after the story of 8, as for some reason it's the shortest episode of the entire season, but we see sad traumatized Ellie who needs to know that her actions have a purpose, and Joel trying to console her very poorly. We get the giraffe scene, then they get to the hospital, and, well, you know the story. He's knocked out, Ellie is forced into surgery without her knowledge. Joel gets mad and kills everyone in the hospital. Again, I love this scene and the way this is framed in the show. I thought it was really impactful and emotional, and Pedro's performance is outstanding. He kills Marlene after she makes a good argument for why she understands how they feel, and then the car scene as Ellie wakes up and Joel lies to her about what happens, and in similar fashion to the game, they hike the rest of the way to Jackson, and right before they get there, Ellie asks if that's really what happened, and Joel says it is. And she says, okay. Cue credits. A very brief summary of the plot that misses a lot of its nuances, but you may see what I'm going with on my one real complaint about the show. Now, as I've said before, I don't think there's any real wasted space in this show. I may think some of the plot lines don't work super well, like the whole Kathleen thing, but still, it's there for a thematic reason. Every episode is offering stuff that plays along the themes and messages of the show, and I think that's really impressive and something to be praised. But at the same time, because they're covering so much, and a still shockingly to me short amount of time, in my opinion, it leaves the actual on-screen relationship between Joel and Ellie as kind of weak outside of just the performances. Any scenes they do share with each other are fantastic. Bella and Pedro have amazing chemistry in these roles, but because of the way a lot of the show is framed and how fast the plot has to move, I feel like we don't really ever get much time to just sit with the characters and breathe. There are a couple of exceptions, don't get me wrong, but especially as they move towards the latter half of the plot, they just don't spend that much actual time together without some other force that they're dealing with directly at the time. And I know, like I said in the adaptation section, that they can't just follow Joel around as they walk endlessly on, getting all these little details and interactions that the game has, but surely they could have worked in a few more things to give us. Or maybe this is just me, I haven't really heard anyone else complain about this, but I really wanted something more tangible to grab onto, because with what we see in the show, Joel is exactly right. He's a bad protector of Ellie. He's a failure. By making him more sympathetic and framing for most of the show, he doesn't often do anything to actually save her. Nothing nearly as drastic as the game up until the very end. And I know you could say that's to build to this moment more and more, which is fine, but it just kind of feels off to me, because for most of the show, he's either just getting to know her, failing to protect her, or failing to really connect with her well, or bleeding out until he has to kill everyone to save her. And I think this was a problem that they could have fixed by adding maybe like one more episode, structuring things just a little differently so we could really see Joel and Ellie just spending good time together outside of these very high tension moments. And I watched a documentary about making this show, and I get Craig and Neil's mindset. In fact, like I said, I think it's a very smart place to be with writing a show like this, as they explicitly say in the documentary that they want to go about writing this story in the simplest way possible. That's not the exact framing, but what they mean by that is they want to deliver these moments with the least amount of fluff getting in the way as possible, for it to be simple and concise and powerful, which is amazing. We don't really have very many TV writers working like that today, and I think it benefited this show in so many ways. But the one and only thing it took away from for me was Joel and Ellie themselves, the emotional core of the show. So even despite the fact that all of these side stories play very well into the themes, I think they specifically needed more time. But that's really it. That's my biggest complaint with the entire show. Outside of that, and even with that, I think this is one of the best case scenarios for a video game television adaptation ever. It's concise, it's in the spirit of the game while also knowing what to change and understanding the medium well. It's exciting and emotional and extremely well acted, so what can you do? I will say with the announcement of them officially adapting Part 2, I'm very nervous for the reasons I expressed in that video, as I genuinely think it's one of the smartest uses of video game storytelling probably ever, and it is probably the most justified use of video games as a story that I've ever seen. But at any rate, they've already said they were going to split that up into at least 2 seasons because of how big the story is, so at least we're getting off on the right foot with that. I'm sure there won't be anything controversial in adapting that story. But yeah, after all of this, even more than I already did, I really trust Neil and Craig's writing ability, and heck, I'm excited to see what they do with one of my now favorite stories ever. And I would definitely recommend checking this show out, especially if you're not really a video game person, because I think this story is something that deserves to be shared with everyone. That being said, I still definitely think I prefer the original video game, mainly because I like the medium better, and I think the story is a bit more impactful when you get to sit with these characters for a long time. And now we get to the section where I'm going to briefly go over all my nitpicks for the show, because I had a lot of nitpicks for the show and I want to share them in some capacity. If that doesn't sound interesting to you, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If that does sound interesting to you and you want to hear me ramble for a bit, keep tuning in for this last little section. It won't be too long. Instantly, the lighting is the most modern TV thing I've ever seen, and I despise it. It's such a well-shot show, and you can't see anything. Why is, quote, natural lighting like this so popular? Please just light your freaking media again. The lack of gameplay and being physically in the space really takes away the shock of Sarah's death for me. Having Joel look for Tommy in the beginning and having them not have as big of a falling out majorly diminishes the feeling of damage that Joel did to Tommy's life through what they were forced to do together. The pacing always feels just a little off in every circumstance, usually because it's either too long or too short due to these weirdly inconsistent runtime. No spores. Why are there no spores? I actually really like the things they do with the infected in this, with their tendrils instead of spores, but the spores were such a cool and unique concept in zombies storylines, it makes me really sad to see no spores. The way they condense the plot of getting Joel and Ellie together is odd. It makes the entire way Joel and Tess help Ellie out feel a lot more uneasy and rushed instead of a particular deal that Joel does for selfish reasons. The flashback before Joel kills the guy is stupid. We would have got it just from framing and performances, guys. They used that song, the one from Arrival, which is unfair and makes me cry. The tunnel in episode 5 is completely pointless and leads to absolutely nothing interesting or plot relevant. Why was it there? Why they changed the point this out on the map and then I'll ask this other guy and he better answer the same exact answer thing to just asking instead of torture is beyond me. At least they kind of make up for it later.
It's okay.
No.
I believe him.
No.
Joel and Ellie's fight and tie back to Sarah is extremely rushed. Oopsie whoopsie, Joel's panic attacks just disappear and are only ever in one episode. Joel isn't very intimidating this time around. Like seriously, he never does a single thing that makes him feel uneasy. In fact, he always feels like he's just barely not dying. Oh no, that pop song cover I didn't like at the end of episode 6 was sung by Craig Mazin's daughter. Why is Ellie the emotional lead of this show? It should be Joel. It's set up as Joel in the beginning of the game, but now it's pretty much the Ellie show by halfway through. Why didn't Joel come into the restaurant? That's one of the best beats. Why did she have to walk outside? He should have gone in there while she was still doing it. I know they had a reason for changing that. I think it's stupid. And that's really it. Those were my random nitpicks and thoughts while watching the show, or at least the condensed version, so it wasn't just like, oh, that was an odd shot. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Genuinely, let me know what you think of the show. I really don't know what the mass opinion on this is since I muted it while it was coming out. Do you love it? Do you hate it? Who knows? Either way, I'm really excited to see the story reach more people, and I sure do hope no one misreads it and gets weird when they adapt part 2. Anyway, I'll probably talk about season 2 of this show when it comes out, but that's not for like another 2 years, so until that's my final word on The Last of Us. Part 2 is the best, the first game is second, and the show is under that, but the show has very unique merits on its own. So far, not a single bad entry into the canon that I've fallen so much in love with. I'm really happy to see it grow into one of the best video game adaptations we've ever got. Thanks for watching. Now I'm finally going to get back to talking about movies. Probably.